During the 1930s and 40s, sandwiched between several events, major and small, there was a sudden burst of interest in the field of computing. As due to the war and academics, it was becoming increasingly apparent that calculating and solving problems were just not happening fast enough. To add to that, the problems in of themselves started to balloon in scale, involving more complexity and making it harder to simplify. So, almost as if in a trance, many across the globe started to make computing hardware of their own, contributing towards the vision of there being an automatic calculating machine. But while there were several machines being produced and showcased around that time, only a few were remembered with any significance. Particularly, there are two systems considered to be in some regards as the roots of this computing age, those being the Harvard Mark I and the ENIAC. The Mark I was designed by Howard Aiken, a graduate student and later professor at Harvard who worked in partnership with IBM to produce and build the machine. The ENIAC was the product of a duo, John Mauchly and J. Presper Eckert, whose project was funded by the U.S. Army and built at the University of Pennsylvania. But of course, with all these other computers being built, what made these two special? Was the technology behind them revolutionary? Were their devices held up by merit alone, or did their influential status come from somewhere else? Well, looking back at the Mark I, it had a standout feature, that being its ability to interpret and perform instructions from an external program. This meant that it could be told to run a series of operations, such as addition or multiplication, with a provided set of instructions, which were typically represented with a continuous roll of tape. And with this tape, it could be programmed by simply punching holes into it, with each hole's placement representing a different way of instructing the machine on what to do with the numbers it had. This came with a major benefit, that being reusability, as it made it convenient to store these programs away in a library of sorts, which they could later pull from and use whenever they needed. However, what's amazing to consider is that, while doing all that, it was still 30 to 100 times faster than a human on average while solving the exact same problem. It's also extremely impressive considering that the machine used mainly off-the-shelf parts, such as the telephone relay, with them only being slightly modified to accommodate the design, which meant that it wasn't running as fast as it could have had it been using more advanced parts from the start. In fact, the ENIAC proved just how much faster a device made with parts as advanced as electronic components could be, as it boasted the ability to outperform machines like the Mark I, claiming to be able to add 5,000 numbers in a second, whereas other machines could do no more than 15 to 50 additions per second. And this incredible speed was thanks to the device's use of vacuum tubes, which could transfer data across the room the machine occupied amazingly fast. However, with the speed came a major flaw. There was no way of instructing the machine with a program similar to that found in the Mark I. Instead, the device had to be manually reconfigured for each task it was used for, which meant that these vacuum tubes had to be moved for every problem. With how much needed to be done, there would be a few people employed whose entire role was dedicated to moving those tubes around. So, while it may have been a fast device, slowdown involved in making it function was a major trade-off to consider when working with it. When you take these two core ideas, programmability and transferring data through electricity, it's amazing to see how much is stuck. For example, the Mark I's highlight feature of reading in a feed of tape and interpreting it is still present to this day, but instead of having to carry a whole roll of tape at all times to run Chrome, the computer itself contains the program and feeds it into its own mini interpreter called the CPU. The concept remains the same, but the execution has gotten more efficient and tightly packed. It's the same case with the ENIAC, where its use of vacuum tubes to orchestrate the flow of electricity is similar to the circuits found in motherboards or computer chips, with the main difference being that it's significantly smaller and embedded at a hardware level. But there comes the question of, how come nobody thought about implementing this stuff before these two? Well, the answer is simple. They did. there were other computers that had the exact same features as these two, yet were made way before them. A prime example of this is a Z3 system, a machine developed by a German engineer, Konrad Zuse, in 1941. It was a device capable of running a series of operations with a feed of instructions, which were typically represented with a continuous roll of punched-out tape. It used mechanical relays to transfer data, similar to that found in a telephone line. Sounds a bit familiar, right? Well, that's because almost everything about it bears a resemblance to the Mark I. However, it's not a machine inspired by it, as some misattribute, because in reality, it was built 3 years before the Mark I's release in 1944. So if a device like this existed and had similar merit to that of the Mark I, why wasn't it considered as one of the roots of this computing age? Well, one factor that definitely played a role in its undue recognition was the fact its development was in complete isolation and secrecy during World War II. So much so that it was even unintentionally destroyed in 1943 during the Berlin firebombs. Thanks to this, it didn't have the outreach or impact that devices like the Mark I and ENIAC had. But that couldn't be the only reason, could it? In reality, the Mark I really only had the backing of Harvard, a prestigious college, and IBM, a growing enterprise. The ENIAC similarly only had the help of the U.S. Army and the University of Pennsylvania, another prestigious university, providing funds and making space for it to become a reality. Surely these big names had no influence over the representation of these machines, right? Well, there isn't any definitive proof that this is the case. However, it's a little hard to believe that this social backing didn't at least play a role in these devices' global recognition, especially from organizations such as the National Science Foundation. So, it might be a good idea to look at how influence played a role at a smaller scale, and how it boiled up from there. A great instance of this is the interesting partnership between Howard Aiken, Harvard, and IBM. Reportedly, IBM spent upwards of $100,000 to handle the R&D and manufacturing of the Mark I, while footing the entire bill themselves. For IBM, this was seen as an easy way to forge more ties with the scientific and educational communities, because by showing goodwill, IBM hoped that, paired with Harvard's prestigious status, this project would increase publicity and favor as a way to convince others that working with IBM was a good idea. But none of this would have been possible in the first place without a special arrangement provided by a common connection, who came in the form of a professor at Harvard, Ted Brown. Had Brown not been there to orchestrate a meeting between Aiken and IBM, it's likely that the machine would have found itself built elsewhere or not at all. In the case of the ENIAC, the connection similarly helped with getting the machine built. However, unlike Aiken, Mauchly and Eckert were able to patent their creation in 1947, marking it as one of the first electronic computers, which they eventually sold the rights to, with it being claimed by a company named Sperry Rand. This allowed Sperry Rand to commercialize work related to the ENIAC, which they almost certainly took great advantage of. In fact, Sperry Rand had gotten a little too comfortable in forcing others to pay royalties for devices that contained any electronic components in them, which eventually led to a lawsuit. In this lawsuit, there was damning evidence found not only for Sperry Rand, but for Mauchly as well. See, it turned out that quite a few concepts that Mauchly included in his patent with Eckert had been flat out stolen from another researcher he was in contact with during the 30s and 40s. That researcher was John Vincent Ansoff, whose work predates Mauchly and Eckert's patent by almost a decade. In 1939, Ansoff, with the help of Clifford E. Berry, built a working prototype of a machine designed to use vacuum tubes. And in 1940, Ansoff had invited Mauchly to take a look at this prototype, as he was excited to find somebody who was equally interested in computing. But when wartime came for the US in 1942, the machine that Ansoff and Berry built would have to be deconstructed, and the patent for it was never filed. During the war, Ansoff and Mauchly would occasionally contact each other, with a few conversations having Mauchly proudly proclaiming to Ansoff that he was working on a device of his own, but guaranteed it would be based on completely different principles than Ansoff's. Unfortunately, that did not turn out to be true, because eventually Ansoff was brought into the lawsuit, and there he found out that the ENIAC had bared too many similarities to his own machine. And after all that was presented, Ansoff's machine, the ABC computer, was officially awarded the title of being the first electronic computer in 1973. However, by then, the damage had already been done, as recognition for the device's influence never reached the same level as the ENIAC's. And that's the unfortunate reality of it all. It's just a natural consequence of everybody rushing for the top, wanting the fame and glory that comes with being somebody revolutionary. And it doesn't matter who gets there first in actuality. All that matters is that the one who makes it there directs the attention of the public to themselves.